Their Stories Foundation presents Descendants, interviews with second and third generation survivors. Today's guests are second generation survivors, siblings Michael Ehrenberg and Laura Ehrenberg Chesler, talking about their father, Oscar Ehrenberg. Welcome. Tell me about your family history and how far back do you know about it?
Well, we know quite a bit. Our grandparents, and Laura, you may have to interject. And since Laura's very active in multiple organizations, she spearheads a lot of the development with the Holocaust Foundation in San Antonio. So she gives talks and lectures, and so some of the
Not as much as I used to.
not as much as she used to, but you still do. So we know, quite a bit. Our grandparents were both from Czechoslovakia. My
Really, actually, Oscar's dad,
Hungary.
our grandfather, I think he was from Germany.
Yeah, they were Czech German, right? Or
Right. He was German. She, I think, was really more sort of Czech Hungarian. And that's not talking about my mom's or our mom's side of the family, which was all Hungarian.
Right. And
who
how
also who came to the US way before the war. In fact, before our grandfather Adolf Vogel came, prior to even World War One, right? I mean, he was
Yeah,
in
late 1800s, he came to Texas.
that's your mom's side,
Yeah.
correct. Just
right?
to give you a little perspective of
Sure.
the
Sure.
family in its entirety.
Interesting that they went to Texas.
My grandfather landed in Ellis Island like everybody else. And I don't know, do you know the exact? Some of his family went to Montreal, right?
I think some went to Montreal. He went first, I think, to Denver and then St. Louis with his brother. And then the brother had like respiratory issues. So the doctors were like, go to San Antonio, it's drier,
Wow.
which it probably was back then.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that's how they got to San Antonio. He made saddles and then eventually morphed it into belts when people stopped riding horses for
Wow.
transportation.
Interesting.
And what's interesting about him specifically was, there were how many Jews? Maybe like three. I mean,
Yeah, not many.
it's quite sparse in terms of the Jewish population. And he and several other families that were, in that population built, I think, the first synagogue. Is that correct, Laura?
Well,
Or
the first Orthodox for
Orthodox?
sure.
Wow.
Yep. So not easy to be Orthodox and keep kosher in San Antonio in the,
Really?
early mid 1900s. So,
Yeah.
but they did.
Did you ever hear of any stories about anti-Semitism in their lives?
Not in
Really, although our grandmother on my mom's side, all of that family was wiped out, except one sister who my grandfather eventually, when the communists invaded Hungary, he brought her over. And she lived first in New York and then in San Antonio. She was
Wow.
older, never really learned English. Was, I
it
think,
never really recovered.
pretty traumatized. She was
Yeah.
older
Right.
when it happened, and her husband was murdered. She did not have children, so that was, I hate to say it, probably good. And but she never really, like Michael said, she never really could, you know, uh uh have sort
Sort
of
of,
a normal life.
yeah,
Right.
she didn't mentally, emotionally recover from, the
Yeah.
trauma. Being older, she came to New York. She was a very elegant lady. Her name was Ilana.
Hmm.
Uh, she worked as a chambermaid in one of the hotels,
Wow.
always dressed very impeccably. And I think our mother told us that the manager or owner of the hotel told her that she was more elegant and educated than 95% of the guests. She had a lot of pride.
She
Wow.
was upper middle class when she lived in Budapest, and they had
Right.
property and apartment buildings and this and that.
And then just a complete change of life. And
Wipe out.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah, it's tough for I'd say it's tougher for a woman, to figure that all out,
Yeah.
Yeah,
in that
She
day and
was
age.
alone.
Yeah, yeah,
totally alone.
yeah. Wow. And so your father's side, what's their background? Where were they from?
I would say mostly Hungary, Germany, and Czechoslovakia.
Hmm.
They were what we would probably consider modern Orthodox. They dressed like upscale middle class people.
Hmm.
Um, they did not dress differently and didn't really look any different. And my dad and his sister were blonde and green eyed,
Mm,
which initially probably helped them when they got to the camps.
right.
And then they were also very highly educated. They had German tutors and, from a young age, from age 3, which also helped because they were both fluent German speakers, like high German. So,
Which, you and I have talked about this, Laura, which we don't know for sure, but we often kind of bring up the fact that our grandparents had them tutored in German almost made us. My grandmother was very astute, from what my father said, and that like she almost had an idea that somewhere intuitively, or I don't know if it was conscious, that it probably was a good idea, just not just to learn German, but that they really might need it at some point. Because anti-Semitism ran rampant all throughout. It wasn't blaringly, obvious, but it was, always threaded into
Yeah,
society, just like it
yeah,
is now.
yeah, yeah. And
And
so,
my grandfather worked, they were very, like Laura said, upper middle class. They were, the word assimilated can be thrown around, but they were more integrated, with society. I mean, my grandfather worked for Shell Oil.
wow.
Uh, So, he was very much a part of uh, work life German society. Um,
And what year was your dad born?
1930.
He was born in 1930. And so tell this, the audience the story of his Holocaust experience.
Burke, you want to start out?
go ahead, because you may have the sequential order, and I'll fill in or add.
So his family had made like put in an application for visas to come to the United States. Shell Oil, in the meantime, had offered to move them once it was clear what was happening, had offered to move them to either Argentina or Venezuela. And my grandmother said, we've already put our application in to go to the States where we have family. So we're going to not do the move to South America. But unfortunately, the US, shut down the immigration. And so they got kind of caught up in the, you know, uh, movement of the Nazis into Czechoslovakia. So my dad and his sister were sent into hiding in Hungary with an aunt and uncle.
So we're talking about 1939.
1943, 1942, 43.
Oh, okay.
So, because remember, Czechoslovakia and Hungary were like some of the last to fall.
Right.
So, they were in hiding and then someone turned them in. First, I'll back up. My grandfather never made it across the border. He was shot. My grandmother did make it across the border. She went to the aunt and uncle's house. Excuse me. And she was there some short period of time, and a neighbor turned her in. So the Nazis literally knocked on the door, said, "Are you Rose Ehrenberg?" She said, "Yes, come with me." Loaded her onto a boxcar where she was shot trying to escape off the boxcar. And how we know that is she was with a friend from the same town who knew her and after the war, told my dad.
Do you remember who that was exactly?
It was Manya.
Oh, that was
Not
Manya.
positive, not positive. It could have been, well, it wasn't Magda because I think Magda lasted for a while,
So
till dad.
they were in their family home for the early part of the 40s. They were,
Yes,
and
yes.
then they decided to leave,
Well, they tried to leave
and your grandfather was shot where?
at the border of Czechoslovakia and Hungary.
Okay, so he was trying to get into Hungary, and then your grandmother was still at home.
I'm unclear about the sequence of who went first or how it
Right.
transpired. And that's, to the best of my recollection, not even in my dad's Showa tape. All those, I don't think he knew.
Yeah.
But she did make it across the border and she did manage to find my dad and his sister and the
So they
uncle.
were put your dad and his sister were put into hiding before the parents tried to leave.
Yes.
Okay.
They were told to put on two or three pairs of clothing, wear, and they were each given like a little pail with some food and stuff. And they paid a non-Jewish farmer to take them across the border on the train. And the farmer, I think, basically said, "Hey, if they, I don't know you, if they try
Right.
to, stop us."
Right.
And my dad, I think, was 11, and my aunt was 13
13.
or 14.
Okay. And so where did they go from there?
They were in hiding with an aunt and uncle. And,
So
eventually somebody turned them in, or the house was raided or whatever, and they got,
they went to the by train to the aunt and uncle's house.
yes,
They were in Hungary and they were in hiding.
for about 2 years, maybe not quite.
Okay, so say from like 41, 42 to 43, 44, early 44. And then do you remember, did he talk about what life was like for him in hiding?
I think it was really stressful. My aunt, I mean, their aunt, the one whose house they were hiding in, had to somehow get food to them and, um, kind of negotiate with the local Nazis to,
It was somewhat like being held hostage in
yeah,
a, you know, loosely worded term, but
yeah.
yeah, essentially they were in hiding. And I mean, they, from what I understand too, Laura, they tried to have like somewhat of a normal existence, whatever that means. Like, isn't that where he had his bar mitzvah in hiding? They
Mhm.
gathered a few men and he read a small portion of the Torah.
Or
Wow.
like, I think he was able to do a couple of blessings or,
Yeah.
but still they made the effort to do that.
Wow. That's nice.
And
As
Michael was really one of the only boys at our temple here in San Antonio, which was Reform, to have a bar mitzvah. Because, back then it was like nobody had bar mitzvahs at a Reform synagogue, but it was really important to my dad. So Michael had one.
And we had, since we were Oscar, our father wanted, felt sort of a certain akin to the Reform Temple at that time. Um, not to go off too much on the tangent of religion, but, I think he sort of detached himself from a lot of the sort of whatever the high religious principles while still feeling very, very much a part of Judaism. Would you say that's true, Laura? I mean, he
I
didn't
wouldn't
really
say
want to
he divorced himself from the principles of Judaism. I would say he divorced himself
commit the religion,
from the outward observance.
right?
So not keeping kosher, didn't really go to synagogue except on the high holy days.
Right.
Um, we did have Passover Seder, but on the other hand, extremely involved in Jewish Federation and anything to do with Israel. He was a very strong Zionist.
Interesting.
And that's how Michael and I grew up. And actually, my dad's grandfather, so I guess our great grandfather, was a member of the Second Zionist Congress, which back then was kind of a big deal.
Hmm.
So,
And so okay, so he was in hiding and with his sister,
mhm.
and what happened next?
Like Michael said, they, I think, tried to keep their education up and live some kind of normal existence. Eventually, they got caught and loaded up into boxcars, which my dad does a decent job describing. He had a great memory and great recall.
So
Um,
who came? So the Nazis came knocking at their house and
I think they probably rounded people up in the town, how they would gather.
came into the town
Yeah.
and
I think if memory serves, that's how they did it. And, people were told, oh, you're going to work or you're going to do this, that. And then they were jammed into these boxcars for 2 or 3 days until they arrived at Auschwitz.
wow.
And even though my dad was young, so he was 13, I think, 13 plus, and small, he wasn't like a big person. Um, he was blonde hair, green eyed, and fit, physically fit. And so somehow he got sent to the right and not the left. And same with my aunt.
which in a way was everything you're describing about him and his, his smallness but strength or whatever. Still, he was in that category of children that easily were sent to the wrong side and gassed, right? I mean, children were pretty
Mhm.
much
Hmm.
But my dad
essentially
was super smart and very clever, kind of wily. So when he got to Auschwitz, he quickly noticed that there was an empty barracks with a Polish Christian prisoner of war. They had the different symbolism on their clothing.
coats or clothes.
Um,
Yeah.
and so he quickly recognized that. And between his check and this and that, he could kind of communicate with the guy.
Hmm.
And he said, could I work for you? Could I help you sweep out your barrack and be a runner or do something? And the guy said yes. And so because of that, the first couple of months he was in Auschwitz, he got a little bit of extra food, which he shared with his friends who were also taken there with him. I mean, people he knew from the town.
Right.
And sometime few months after they were there, this Polish guy said, there's going to be a Nazis coming through here, or SS, and they're going to ask for volunteers who knows how to read slide rule. I'll teach you how to read a slide rule and you can teach your friends. So he taught him how to read the slide rule because they were then going to get jobs in a munitions factory. And my dad taught his however many friends he could teach. And he talked about how, they would line them up in the yards, I guess every morning. And the SS came through and they asked who knows how to read a slide rule. My dad said he like did a sharp salute and in perfect German was like, I know how to do that.
Wow.
And so he was selected, his cousin was selected, the people he had taught were selected. And I don't think at that point in the war anybody was surviving Auschwitz.
Yeah.
So,
Very few.
And where was your aunt at this time?
they were separated.
She was
She
in
has a show
Auschwitz.
a tape as well.
Okay. She was in
Um,
Auschwitz.
Yes.
yeah, but they separated immediately the men and the women.
Right.
But someone had told our father that they had seen her, right? Don't you remember that? That I think that's how he knew A, she
Hey
was there.
guys, could you excuse me for 1 second? Burke, will you take over for one
Yes,
minute?
sure. So somehow communications between people were, although scant, they were there was some information being communicated between people in prison and
Yeah,
on both sides, if
right.
that makes sense.
And did she talk? So she did a show interview herself,
Yes, which weirdly enough, I have not really watched, which is
right?
just out of pure like, not time, but just I
You
need to do.
haven't done it yet.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And so your dad was is okay, so he learned the slide rule and he volunteered.
correct.
And then what happened after that?
Well, so I mean, it in some strange fashion, it part of it was, his unknown of what was going to happen, but I think intuitively, and he's kind of mentioned this, that it bided him some time. I think that was really the key is like, of survival is what else can I be doing to help me
Yeah.
deal with the situation at hand and create a survival, platform for myself.
Yeah. It's very interesting I don't think I've ever really thought about it because we look at it in terms of we're looking back on it. So we know when the end game is,
Yeah.
right? And for them, for your dad, he's going one day at a time. He doesn't know I've got to make it to, liberation date.
No,
You
not at
know,
all.
they think this could go on forever or this could end next week or, so they're just, live for another just live for another day.
Do whatever you can to survive. And I think part of that is, your survival instinct, and part of it was his fortitude that he already had growing up. I think his parents really instilled a certain strength. And one of the things that's always fascinating with me about survival is what you do in advance to plan. Because most of the time you don't, right? You're just when the situation falls on you,
Right.
you're literally in like like rats on in a tunnel.
Right.
And his parents had written and had them memorize their relative's address in the United States. So just to give you a broader perspective, there were
Wow.
on my grandmother's side, Rose, there were four brothers and four sisters. Two of them, Gizzy and uh, the other one's escaping my name. Two of them had come to the United States. Two of the sisters and two of the brothers, uh, Ernie and Joseph, were already in the U.S. So that's a little bit further down the road, but that's
Right.
how once they were liberated, they were able to contact. And ironically, my Uncle Joe was the one that came to get my father in after he had, been liberated and was in an American camp being, treated and recouped.
Right.
Um, so he was,
Sorry, guys.
that's okay. Joe was serving in the army, in the U.S. Army, and I sort of skipped ahead so we can
It's
backtrack, but
okay.
I was just giving John sort of a portrait of our family and how they,
Well, yeah,
two and two.
yeah, we're talking about like the resourcefulness and like the pre-planning um of, like Michael mentioned, like memorizing the addresses in the United States and, I mean, not every, I mean, and I think the the survivors that we've talked to, that resourcefulness is a common thread, it's like, they're just they have that kind of a brain and they have that kind of a fortitude, you
Yeah, I
know.
mean, what were you doing when you were 11?
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying? Like, I know what I was doing. I was playing with plastic horses and, you
I
know,
know.
looking forward to my next track meet. So,
Right. I mean, yeah, that's what I was gonna when you're talking about your dad being on that train for 2 days. I mean, what does that make you feel as his kids? Like, I mean, how do you when you picture it and knowing your dad and I mean, is it a really sad feeling?
Um, I don't, I wouldn't say it's a sad feeling. When I was young, I was very preoccupied with the fact that he didn't have parents. I
Mm,
kept asking him, like, I think you should go look for them. Sort of upsetting to me that he didn't know where they were or what happened. I'm like, maybe they're still alive. Like, we should go look for them.
right.
Um, but
So
I can't say
did you sense an emptiness there?
um,
I mean, also for you. I mean, it's your grandparents.
I think, for me, for sure, it was like a benign emptiness, but not, meaning like because he didn't really talk about it that much growing up, but
ever.
there's
Right.
never really until he really was in his 50s, right? Before he kind of came out and started talking about it, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Hmm.
And people engaged him. So, for example, he was very connected to non-Jewish communities. We had the Jewish community in San Antonio was very right, wouldn't you say, close to like the Episcopalian and the uh no,
The reform.
four. So we kind of had this, and maybe I'm glorifying it, but it was like there was a mutual kind of camaraderie. And so remember, was it Pastor, what was it, the guy's name at the Baptist church that invited Oscar to come over?
Oh, that's another thing you
Buckner
could
Fanning.
actually listen to if you wanted. Reverend, just a
Fanning.
second,
Buckner Fanning? No.
Buckner Fanning,
Great
How's
name.
that?
uh,
How's that for
Trinity
a
Baptist
name?
Church.
That's quite a name.
Yeah, he was quite a guy, actually. He
It
was a
really was.
character. But yeah, Trinity Baptist Church. My dad worked hard to have good, uh, make San Antonio a place where all the religions got along. The Christians and the Jews.
Hmm.
Um,
And so going back into the chronological story, he raised his hand for the slide rule, and then what happened after that?
they were loaded onto another train and taken to a munitions factory, kind of, I think, in a forest somewhere. And, they were given a little bit more food, not much, and basically the same general conditions of any concentration camp. No warm clothes. Um, they were starving to death.
Right,
So
right.
He contracted quite a few different illnesses. Like, remember, didn't he have like genital, like sores and all this? It was like all kinds of weird.
from starvation, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just
Starvation and weather.
sores all over his
Yeah.
body,
Well, not clean,
lice.
not having
I
clean
don't think he ever
clothes.
got typhoid, but a lot of them did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dysentery, that kind of stuff
Yeah.
from not having clean water. And
And so they were both in Auschwitz, your aunt and your dad, and so he went to work in the ammunition factory and then what was he liberated from that point?
no, as the Americans were
Okay.
marching their way towards Germany in these camps and having, a lot of success, the Germans got very nervous about being caught and whatnot. So they went on what my dad would had described as like a death march and marched them to another camp. And he said if you stumbled or fell down, they
Yeah.
just put the rifle to the base of your skull and pulled the trigger, and everybody kept going. And they made it to this next camp, which was, I think, Ginskirchen in Austria, and that is where he was liberated from. Although he had managed to keep his cousin alive the whole time, but the cousin was much taller than him and a little older, kind of a bigger boy. And so at the very end, he died. And my dad does describe that, and he does talk about that in his show a tape.
Wow.
And once Emmy was dead, my dad went with some of the older prisoners, and they escaped. But at that point, the Germans had pretty much fled.
They were fleeing. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And so he and these few men wandered through the forest. They came to a cabin where some German people were, or Austrians, and they knocked on the door, and, of course they were skeletal. And
Yeah.
so they basically, I think, frightened these old people into giving them food. And they did, but then of course, because they hadn't eaten anything, they got like sick from it.
Yeah.
And
I
then
guess.
they kept making their way through the forest to a road. And as they were walking down the road, an American, I can't tell this part, Michael, you tell it.
Okay. So as they were, walking down the road, they see lights coming at them and, blinding lights, and not they were unsure of what was happening. And my Oscars told me, he said, we thought our gooses were cooked, right? That, Oscar would get. And, that was it. They just thought they're coming after us. He didn't had no idea that the Americans were advancing. I mean, he probably hadn't heard of, that things were
They
rapidly.
heard the planes flying overhead. They
Yeah.
could see, but
And so it turns out this truck was full of young American soldiers, probably 19, 20 at the most. And they saw Oscar and his colleagues, um, skeletal and sores infected, and they were American soldiers. They were three young guys. They picked him up, loaded him into the Jeep, and
actually they only took Oscar because the others wouldn't fit.
uh,
And he
did
was the
not.
youngest and the smallest and probably the closest to death. So they picked him up and they put him in their truck. The others followed. Maybe they went back and I don't know, but they followed to a makeshift hospital.
Wow.
And Oscar describes as they were cutting the clothes off of him, they began like to bathe him, and
Right.
the soldiers were, sobbing.
Oh God.
Yeah, just,
Yeah, and they're like, like you said, they're 17, 18, 19-year-old kids,
yeah,
themselves, and
yep.
having to witness that, is a whole other trauma. And where was your that's amazing. It's an amazing story, and I'm so happy that he got out and got picked up on the road like that. Um it's so cinematic, that part is, you know, can really picture it so well.
I've so
Um,
wanted to make a movie just about sort of weaving the story of trauma and survival, but kind of in a uplifting and positive way, if there's any thread of that in a
Well,
in a
Oscar did make it uplifting. His Trinity Baptist speech was all about the good things that happened to
Oh, he
him.
really did. He was
I mean,
such a bon
super
vivant.
positive. Yeah.
He was so scarily like, just loved everything.
yeah.
And he
I
actually was drafted into the American Army during the Korean War
Wow.
and sent back to Austria to interrogate Hungarian escapees from the Iron Curtain. So,
Amazing. Amazing.
and he loved the military, loved everything about it. He
Wow.
said he was the only guy who thought the food was good.
And
How
where
about the story of them? Where were they going? They were crossing the ocean somewhere, and
The Atlantic.
the Atlantic, right, of course, going back. And he said, it was one of those like where it was violently tossing and turning, and everyone was like, over the side of the boat sick. and he was like the only one like downstairs eating, you know.
He's like, "Oh, you don't want that? I'll take
Yeah.
it."
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Wow. Yeah. And what happened to your aunt?
She survived when my uncle, which I know Michael told you, brought them back to Joliet to live with another aunt and
I
uncle.
actually didn't tell them that part, but I mean, I
Yeah.
He
we
talked
started.
them out of going to Israel and come to the States and live with relatives,
Hmm.
which they did. And my aunt was being treated, they probably both were, but being treated by a physician who'd been a flight surgeon in World War II. And they got married.
He fell
So,
in love with her.
yeah. And
Wow.
they had a 50 odd year happy marriage and two kids. And
Wow.
she
Yeah.
was a great seamstress and linguist, and she taught French, and she was actually a really good stockbroker. I mean, she did it just for her and her husband, but she was a good investor. So
And what did Oscar do?
he was in the investment business. He was an investment banker, and in those days you could do it all. He was a stockbroker, an investment banker. He brought companies public. He was a partner in a regional firm, and
Where did he get educated?
so when he came to the States, he was 16, did not speak English, started in his junior year of high school at Joliet Township High, graduated on time in 2 years, and got into the University of Illinois and worked in a steel mill and in a frat house in the Catskills to put himself through school.
Wow. Amazing.
He
Amongst
was
all the
super
women that
smart.
he was chasing.
Right.
And then did he catch one?
He did. He
And
caught my mom
Where did they meet?
in Chicago. They got fixed up on a blind date.
Uh-huh.
And I think after 3 dates, he proposed. And my
yeah, my
mom was
mother
like,
didn't want to marry him. She kept saying, I can't marry you. And then one day he stopped by her apartment and she said she was walking down the stairs to meet him, and he was sitting on a rolled up like rug like that it was being cleaned or whatever.
that was actually their first date, Burke.
No,
He'd been
wasn't it?
playing tennis. Uh-huh.
Wait, I thought they played tennis first, then no.
So Oscar was playing tennis with a guy that was dating Millie's friend or roommate.
Roommate or yeah.
And that Oscar came to the apartment. She came downstairs and he was sitting on
He
a
was
rolled up.
sitting on a rug, kind of like with his hands like this. And she said, ooh, I like him or something. I don't know.
Anyway, they did not get engaged after 3 dates, but probably after about 6 months of him, to Michael's,
Haranguing her.
going to the apartment, making all the sisters eggs and cooking them breakfast, he persuaded her.
So she was from Chicago?
San Antonio. She was working in
Oh.
Chicago.
Oh, okay.
She had gone to Sophie Newcomb, which is Tulane University, and which was, fairly unusual for a woman. And not that no one went, but it wasn't, you know, protocol. So she had
Right.
gone to
Yeah.
school there and then moved to Chicago. Her father was, while Orthodox, was sort of like modern in a certain way, like, you
He
know,
had 4 daughters and they all went to college and they all got jobs and,
Yeah.
you know,
And so when did you two hear about this story? How old were you when you heard about the Holocaust story?
oh, well, we were in Sunday school and they used to show us those really terrible movies.
yeah,
Right.
people just
Um,
like skeletals coming out.
digging
Yeah.
up the bodies out of the mass
Yeah.
graves and
Yeah,
all
all
that
the
stuff.
all that harsh footage, yeah.
Yeah,
And what's
we
interesting for me is that I remember, there was a certain part of me that was horrified. Of course, even as a kid, you're like, God, what? There was, you didn't get what was, at age
Yeah.
7 or 8. I
Yeah,
didn't
it doesn't make
quite
sense.
get it. And then I think we must have, or I did tell my mother what we saw. And she said, well, your father went through the exact same thing. And she said it very, almost sort of bluntly, but not. in any, I didn't really digest it emotionally, except like trying to make sense of it because
So
it's like,
that
wait, he's here, not there. There's
right.
that whole,
Yeah. So that's when you first heard about it. You saw the films, and then your mother told you, and then did your dad talk about it at all at that point?
Not really.
You just sort of got that little bit of information, and did you think about it a lot, or did you just
I
you,
didn't
you couldn't put it into context, you couldn't make put your dad into that story,
situation. Yep.
right?
I
Could
think
I
I
could
thought about it a little bit, and we had somebody came and painted a swastika in our driveway and dumped horse manure on his car. And so we did have, you know, I don't know. I remember as a younger, I don't know how old I was, sitting in temple, and your back is to the doors that open, people walk in, thinking, what if somebody comes in here like with a machine gun? We're so vulnerable, like they could just start spraying. What would I do? How would I get under the seats? That kind of stuff. I remember very distinctly thinking
oh,
that.
and I did not.
No.
Well, thank goodness nothing bad happened, but
Yeah, but the fact that, that comes into your mind is, at that age,
yeah, I was probably 10,
and
9,
did
10.
your dad eventually talk about it?
Well, he did talk like the Showa tape was a time he talked about it.
And when did
He
he do?
did talk to the different we have a lot of Air Force and Army bases here. And so on Holocaust Remembrance Day, he was asked frequently to go and recount his. I mean, at some point, I know we talked about it, but
It was
it
so
was,
threaded into our, you
yeah,
know, the advancements of our age and time that
Yeah.
it was
Just
threaded, not like a
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. A little bit at a
It's a good
time.
way of saying it.
Yeah.
Wasn't
And
a no.
did you did you could you recognize any trauma in him?
I did.
Yeah.
Some of it was so subtle, but we noticed sometimes that there was sometimes a deep sadness if he let himself go there. If he really, right, he would cry sometimes at stuff, and
Yeah, if he saw kids starving, how they used to do the ads for the kids in Africa,
Yeah.
he would sometimes do not be able to control himself. But
Hmm.
um and then, he was a little bit, you don't know it as a kid, you don't really get it, but
Yeah.
thinking back, he was sort of distant in a way. He couldn't he was super jovial and like happy outside, but I think he kind of had a little struggle with, he was a great dad,
Yeah.
but like real warmth, or I don't know, how would you describe it, Burke?
Well,
Like that.
maybe afraid to get a little bit too close, or
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And
and
like
yet
if
he
I would
was
get upset about like normal teenage stuff, he'd be like, what? Like basically, what is wrong with you? You have a perfect life.
right.
And he was right, but it also wasn't like super sympathetic.
Right, yeah.
So,
He's
you
like
know, but it does toughen you up. It does toughen you up. When I think I'm
as
cold,
children.
I'm like, I don't know what cold is. And when I think I'm hungry, it's like, I don't really know what it's like to be hungry. So
Yeah,
it does give you a good kind of like
your
framework.
perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, that it has to come from that source, but it does sound like he lived a good life and a joyful life.
He
You
was
know,
a very much a bon vivant.
which is
Yes.
wonderful, and like you said, he made it sounds like he had joy and and happiness and it's understandable. I mean, I've talked to other survivors and they're like, we would laugh at the most gruesome things that we went through because that was the only thing you could do. If
The
you,
good coping mechanism.
yeah, if you didn't laugh about it, the other option is far worse,
I think that's part of also part of the Jewish DNA in a certain way, just the humor part and
Right.
taking something and not making it funny, but coping in such a way that you could survive and see it in a different light,
Mm-hmm.
but relatable.
Yeah. And for me, whenever I have a screening of our film, and I say to people, I hope you enjoy it, I really mean it. Like, I really
Yeah.
mean, like, our shared experience, us getting together like this today and talking about such hard stories, but it's a human connection, it's something we have to do, I feel.
Have you ever seen the film uh Forgiving Mengele?
I know that film, yeah, but I can't remember if I finished it. Yeah.
Our cousin happened to edit it. He's a, I guess, somewhat known editor. And does he make his own movies, David? I don't know.
Sometimes, huh, David?
David Simpson. I don't know if you know that name, but anyway, um, I saw the film and actually with Diane and Ken and Oscar when he was not well. Um, and anyway, I would recommend it to you just because this is your sort of
Yeah.
passion or
Yeah.
work or whatever.
I'll definitely.
And
Yeah.
she was interesting. We actually had a fundraiser for the Holocaust Museum and screened that film in a sort of artsy theater here and invited the whole San Antonio community for a donation, $10 or $15, whatever. A lot of kids.
Yeah.
She was spoke at the end of the film in person
Hmm.
and did like a Q&A.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, there were every high school kid that came to that, and there were a number of them, stood in line to give her a hug
Wow.
when she was done speaking. They
Amazing.
waited, it was a long line down the aisle of the theater to be able to just touch her, talk to her, and sort of be with her for a minute. It was very moving to see.
Amazing.
She was
Amazing.
very inspirational.
Amazing. How do you guys feel about what's going on in the world today? Like, do you feel do you experience anti-Semitism? I know you see it around you, you see it in our society. How does it make you feel?
Oh, wow.
That's a
We
big
don't have it.
question.
Yeah, we don't have it so much in San Antonio. Um, or at least I'm not in the places where they're doing that stuff. Um,
Had a few
when I
things though.
see what,
Happen.
hun?
Haven't you had a few things happen or
The fact that it's out there, right? I mean, the fact that it's it's in our culture now, and
it's become more mainstream
it is.
Yes.
Yeah, and
again?
what do you can you put any kind of sense into that? Like, or is it just the another excuse time to, you know, blame the Jews for something or
Yes, yes, and yes. Um, for me, uh, this is both horrific and it's also an opportunity. So when I say opportunity, it's for us, not just as Jews, but as a society to really stand up, really be vocal, really meet it head on, as painful and sometimes scary. Um, but I feel like, given what happened in the past and not just the Holocaust, I think a lot of people either don't realize or aren't willing to incorporate the history of anti-Semitism and current behavior because it goes back. It's just what's happening now is absolutely nothing new. They're old tropes that have been repackaged. So
Mhm.
now if you're anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism. That's the left wing's mantra. And um, I just really feel that we if we don't say anything and do anything, we're at fault. We're
Yeah.
the ones that, every other culture, whether it's the Black Lives Matter, whatever it is, have made more than a cause and stood up, and society sort of kowtowed and bowed to it.
Yeah.
I think we need to, if we don't do that, we're asking for more of what we've been getting.
I,
Berkey.
that's a
Yeah.
really good point. Really good point.
I think those
Or,
other groups do something in the past we have been unwilling to do, and that
Right.
is to frighten people, whether it's to frighten them physically, which is what's been happening on campuses, right? Physical violence, or threaten them with economics. I'm not going to buy your tennis shoes. I'm not going to go to your restaurant. I'm not going to do if you support the Jews. I'm going to boycott your stuff. I'm going to wreak havoc at your companies, which is what the whole DEI, all that stuff is. It's blackmail, but they do it and they do it very effectively. The Jews don't do that. And Israel has an opportunity to do it now. And I'm hopeful that they will, but I'm also doubtful that they will. So
yeah.
because animals and the different cultures do not have the same, they don't have Western values. They don't have the same culture and thought process. So we have to do something different, in my opinion. We've been doing the same thing since 48, actually, really, way before the formation of the State of Israel. We allowed ourselves to get loaded into boxcars. We've allowed ourselves and been frightened and submissive, and Israel's sort of doing it again. I know it's to get the hostages back, but we're allowing ourselves to be humiliated on the world stage by letting them parade these people onto a stage and jeer at them and all that stuff. I mean, who does that? And so there is a reason why we continue to be persecuted, besides the fact that it's just easy to do.
Right.
So I don't, I don't pretend to have a lot of the answers, but not continuing to do the same thing and having the same result seems like a good idea. I mean,
We've been letting and making so many deals that have just turned into literally like putrid, garbage.
well, look
Uh,
at Gaza. No Jews live there since 2007.
yeah.
Land for peace does not work.
Nope. And I'm not sure what this whole appeasement is, and what is the expectation that will happen when you have a very specific, right now it's Islam and the Islamo-fascists that are dead set on annihilating us. And while they say, they talk out of both sides of their mouth, oh no, no, Jews, we live together, you know, in peace and harmony before the state of Israel was formed, which we all know is probably the biggest lie that is around, especially if you talk to Mizrahi and Arab Jews who have lived under oppression, persecution way before, going back hundreds and hundreds of years. So I'm
I
more
mean, the
curious about,
Holocaust happened before the state of Israel was
oh yeah,
established. So,
I don't know if I'm answering your question or
It's
putting
okay.
a
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. No, it's okay. So let's just get back to your dad for a minute. And when did he pass?
2007.
2007. Well, let's can we say his full name out loud
Sure.
in
Oscar
honor?
Michael Ehrenberg.
So we honor you, Oscar Michael Ehrenberg, and
Definitely.
thank you both for sharing his story and other members of your family. I'm touched, really. I'm getting emotional just hearing his name. And yeah, thank you both so much for doing this interview, and I really appreciate it. Any final words you'd like to say, or
I just want to say thank you. It's been such, you're a really lovely person. I'm so glad uh, Michael looped me into this so that I could meet you and have a chance to talk a little bit about Oscar.
yeah, thank
I
you.
I want to honor what you're doing, not just for us and for, our tribe, but just for humanity, right? Just to underscore and kind of highlight, different parts of the existence of, not so great parts of our history, and to bring in the humanness and the personal actual stories, documentations of people's experiences. So
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it's
you're doing good work.
thank you. It's I say the pleasure's mine. I enjoy it. As hard as it can be and as exhausting it is to listen to stories sometimes, it's very, very fulfilling. So I appreciate both of you taking the time, and I look forward to meeting you in person one day.
Yeah,
Yes,
for sure.
definitely. I was
Let's
thinking the
stay in
same
touch.
thing. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, John.